Current culture can make heroes out of people and then shortly afterwards tear them down. In our reading today, this happens to Paul and Barnabas in an even more extreme way. If it wasn't for the fact that there may have been even more severe consequences, it could almost have been another comic interlude in the book of Acts. But before I say more, let's hear our reading from Acts chapter 4, verses 8 to 28. In Lystra, there was a man who had been born with crippled feet and had never been able to walk. The man was listening to Paul speak. When Paul saw that he had faith in Jesus and could be healed, so he looked straight at the man and shouted, "Stand up!" The man jumped up and started walking around. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they yelled out in the language of Laconia, "The gods have turned into humans and have come down to us." The people then gave Barnabas the name Zeus and gave Paul the name Hermes because he did the talking. The temple of Zeus was near the entrance to the city. Its priest and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifice to Barnabas and Paul. So the priest brought some bulls and flowers to the city gates. When the two apostles found out about this, they tore their clothes in horror and ran to the crowd shouting, "Why are you doing this? We are humans just like you. Please give up all this foolishness. Turn to the living God who made the sky, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In times past, God let each nation go its own way, but he showed that he was there by the good things he did. God sends rain from heaven and makes your crops grow. He gives food to you and makes your hearts glad." Even after Paul and Barnabas had said this, they could hardly keep the people from offering a sacrifice to them. Some leaders from Antioch and Iconium came and turned the crowds against Paul. They hit him with stones and dragged him out the city thinking he was dead. But when the Lord's followers gathered around Paul, he stood up and went back into the city. The next day he and Barnabas went to Derbe. Paul and Barnabas preached the good news in Derbe and won some people to the Lord. Then they went back to Lystra, Iconium and Antioch in Pisidia. They encouraged the followers and begged them to remain faithful. They told them, "We have to suffer a lot before we can get into God's kingdom." Paul and Barnabas chose some leaders for each church, then fasted and prayed that the Lord would take good care of these leaders. Paul and Barnabas went on through Pisidia to Pamphylia, where they preached in the town of Perga. Then they went down to Attalia and sailed to Antioch in Syria. It was there that they had been placed in God's care for the work they had just completed. After arriving in Antioch, they called the church together. They told the people what God had helped them to do and how he had made it possible for Gentiles to believe. They then stayed there with the followers for a long time. Paul and Barnabas had escaped persecution in previous places in Asia. That's modern-day Turkey. However, in Lystra, their welcome could not have been imagined. Having used power in evangelism and in healing a lame man, much to their surprise, they were welcomed as gods. Lystra was famous for having a temple to Zeus, so it perhaps wasn't surprising they thought Barnabas and Paul were gods. However, Paul and Barnabas seem surprised and have to try and talk the people down. They were not welcomed just as heroes, but deified. This seems difficult, as the Lystrians were set on a party. However, just as they succeeded and people were maybe thinking they were imposters, Jewish non-believers arrive from Antioch and Iconium and stir up more trouble for them. Fortunately, the stoning was not fatal, and supporters could take care of Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas seem to have had little success in Lystra, but more as they went to Derbe. On return through Lystra, Iconium and Pisidian Antioch, they appear to have more success second time around. However, the key task was to pray for and appoint leaders who would probably have a difficult time supporting new Christians in places where there were many that were in opposition to them. They were likely to only have limited support from Paul's letters and other visitors passing through. When they returned to Syrian Antioch, to the people who had commissioned them and sent them out, it gave them a chance to encourage them as to what God had been doing. So a story of success and persecution, but an encouragement as to what God could do in testing circumstances and what new Christians could step up to do. Let us pray. Lord, help us to use good times to keep us going when times get hard. Help us to trust God and step up into things when asked to do so, even if we feel inexperienced. Help us to trust in and rely on your strength. Amen.